Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. This is our sixth public event of the Gender Research Institute series of talks, Times of Crisis. I'm Annabelle Martin, the director of the Gender Research Institute. I'm also a faculty member here in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and in Women's and Gender Studies and Comparative Literature. We began Times of Crisis now on April 10th, and it concludes. Our last event will be this Friday, May 16th. We've had 5 weeks of very intense debate and dialogue with a wide array of speakers whose work is closely tied with the theme of crisis and social engagement. If you were with us for the first event, you will recall a very thoughtful and tense debate that a Dartmouth panel of social activists and alums spurred. That was followed by the talk of Dennis Goldberg, the distinguished South African historical figure and political prisoner of the ANC. Our second event brought together the minds of John Berger and Noam Chomsky. This was followed with the visit of journalist and social activist Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, internationally distinguished photographer and war photographer James Nachtwey met with GRID fellows and gave a public talk last Tuesday on his work in Afghanistan. And last Thursday, we were given a paradigm with which to rethink the relations between capitalism, neoliberalism, and feminism by social and critical theorist Nancy Fraser, a talk that beautifully framed and prepared us for today's visit by the Director of Gender and Development at the World Bank, Jeni Klugman. We could not be happier to have you here with us, Jeni, and I want to publicly acknowledge your thoughtfulness and your answering questions and giving us a sense of what the World Bank does over lunch. Our last event is this Friday at 4 p.m. in Filene Auditorium. Times of Crisis closes with the visit of renowned social activist, scholar, and freedom fighter, Angela Davis. I hope you'll join us for our last event on Friday. So it's been a very intense 5 weeks. I hope all of you have benefited from the talks, the discussions, the debates, meeting these very distinguished people. I've explained in these introductions over the past few weeks to the new members of the audience, I apologize for those of you who've already heard this, that what Times of Crisis is, what the Gender Research Institute's goals and aspirations are. And what we're trying to do is to bring together under this new institutional framework our teaching, our research, and social engagement. So each spring, GRID organizes a seminar around an issue, a topic of pressing interest of the faculty and students. Last year, our series was called Seeds of Change, Scholarship, Gender, and Social Justice. This year, it's Times of Crisis, and next year, our topic will be Just Words, freedom of speech, and social justice. So the seminar is actually 3 things. It's a Women's and Gender Studies course, which this spring 11 students are in that class. It's the GRID seminar where faculty, students, and senior administrators at Dartmouth join together for weekly debates on the books or works of art produced by the guest speakers. And then the seminar, the Times of Crisis, is also this community event where people from the community come together and it's open to the public, for all the general Dartmouth public. So that's the way we're trying to bring these 3 strands together. So no discussion of crisis within the Gender Research Institute would be complete without thinking about the economic implications of the current global state of affairs and how they particularly affect the lives of women around the globe. With that in mind, we invited Jeni Klugman, the Director of Gender Development at the World Bank, to help us understand these connections and the implications they have in regards to social justice. The framing of value, of labor, and justice run many times counter to an economic logic that is framed exclusively in market or neoliberal terms. What I mean by that is a logic that forgets how unpaid work is not only domestic, but intensely social as well. Ms. Klugman's projects at the World Bank dialogues with this framing, and I'm sure that her talk will bring out some of the differences and highlight how these tensions and intersections in thinking around the problems at hand are key for advancing social and economic justice around the world and at home. Ms. Klugman has been involved with the World Bank in different capacities since 1992, holding various positions, all of which have focused on poverty, inequality, and human development in low-income countries in Africa, Europe, and Asia. In 2011, she took on the position as lead spokesperson on gender equality, and she is responsible for developing strategic directions to support the institution's gender and development priorities. Hearing her speak today at our lunch session on just how policy is framed at the World Bank hopefully offered our fellows some special insights on how important all gender-related work at Dartmouth actually is. Ms. Klugman also serves on several advisory boards, including the World Economics Forum, Advisory Board on Sustainability and Competitiveness, the Council on Foreign Relations, Plan International, International Civil Society Network, and a long, long et cetera. Jeni Klugman has a very distinguished and prolific list of publications, books, reports, papers on topics ranging from poverty reduction strategies in labor markets to conflict, health reform, education, decentralization. She was the director and lead author of 3 very important global human development reports published by the United Nations Development Program, one of them titled Overcoming Barriers, Human Mobility and Development, another, The Real Wealth of Nations, Pathways to Human Development, and a third, Sustainability and Equity, A Better Future for All. This last one published in 2011. Jeni holds a PhD in economics from the Australian National University. You will see by her lovely accent when she speaks, as well as postgraduate degrees in law and development economics from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. We're very lucky and privileged. She could squeeze us into her very demanding schedule. Jeni flew in and flies out, very good. And to have the privilege of hearing her talk to us about her work, her goals, and aspirations. So please help me in welcoming Jeni Klugman to Dartmouth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annabelle, and to Sue as well for inviting me up to Dartmouth. It's a lovely afternoon, and it's great to be here. What I was going to do was to spend a bit of time outlining some key findings from a recent global report that we did. The World Bank is a large institution that works in many countries around the world. What I'm going to be doing today is presenting key messages and findings from a global knowledge product, which was actually done as a companion to one of the World Development Reports. Every year, the bank does a kind of major flagship report, the major flagship report. Themes differ from year to year. In 2013, the theme was jobs. It was a very nice report. It laid out kind of challenges and opportunities on the jobs front, but there was a sense that that report did not have a sufficiently explicit focus on gender and gender constraints and opportunities with respect to the jobs agenda. So we took up that kind of opportunity and challenge to prepare a companion to that report, and that's what I'll be talking about this afternoon. And what I'm going to do is to paint a picture of where we stand in terms of the jobs agenda. I think with a couple of findings that may be surprising for some of you. Talk about why we see the patterns that we do, and a theme of overlapping deprivation comes out quite clearly from the analysis that we're able to undertake. And then finally talk a little bit about the policy agenda, and that's about igniting women's work. The first point to make, though, at the outset is that when we talk about equality in the world of work, we don't mean that everybody should be doing exactly the same thing. It's much more about choice and capabilities to exercise a range of choices in terms of education, in terms of life choices, as well as in terms of careers. So I think it's important to say that at the outset, that when we see perfect equality, we won't actually necessarily see exactly the same outcomes, but I think we would see a picture that's very different from that which we see today. Because when we look at the picture that we see today, and this is showing groups of countries, high income, middle income, upper middle and lower income, middle income countries, as well as low income countries, and patterns in terms of work, there are a couple of very important points to make. The first is that most of the world's working poor, and especially women, are not in wage employment. They're working on farms or they're working in informal employment. And that's shown by the colours which are here. So the dark green represents wage employment, the light represents self-employment, and then the other green represents farming. So let's look at high-income countries. This is the US, for example. Pretty similar proportions, actually higher proportions of women in wage employment than in other forms of employment overall. Men more engaged in self-employment, and entrepreneurs and so on. But let's look at the case in low-income countries. You see that very few, and actually I think the figure's around 11% of women who work, so this is among women who work in low-income countries, are actually holding some kind of wage employment job. Wage employment means that you have at least some degree of security, that you're working for some agreed rate. It may not be a high rate, it may still be badly paid, the conditions may not be good, but particularly in low-income countries, the conditions are likely to be better than someone who's working in subsistence farming, for example, or trying to eke out a living from low-income, low-return activities. So I think the important initial point to make, certainly for people who are less familiar with low-income countries, is that we need to take a very broad view of jobs. And if we're talking about jobs and wages, thinking only about the formal sector will exclude a lot of people, I think, whom we should be interested in. And so where do we stand, broadly speaking, with respect to gender differences in the world of work? What we see is that there are a series of gaps, and we can classify these into kind of three buckets. And this is kind of the way that we've been thinking about the issues. There are other ways of, I think, approaching and categorising. But broadly speaking, we can see differences in terms of the types of jobs that women have. And I've already alluded to that already. But what we do see when we look systematically at the sorts of occupations in which women and men work, the sorts of sectors in which they work, there are systematic differences across countries. Women much more concentrated into kind of low pay, low return activities in the economy. So related to that, and this is the second point, is that women consistently earn less than men. This is an area where data is particularly scarce, but the wage gaps range between about 20 to about 70%, broadly speaking, for the same type of work. So very significant wage differences, oftentimes as well related to the different types of kind of sectors and the jobs that women are able to do. And then finally, on participation, and this is whether or not women and men are either in the labour force with a job or actively looking for work. So that's the concept of labour force participation that economists use. You'll see it as well in the US debate. It comes out every month or every quarter with the release of jobs figures. And here, I think it's a somewhat surprising finding that despite the increases in education that we've seen for girls over the past couple of decades, in particular in terms of primary schooling at least, women's labour force participation globally is falling. So the global rate has actually fallen from 57 to 55%. More significantly in some countries, so for example in India it's fallen by several percentage points. There are some exceptions and I'll go into that in a moment. So there's a couple of kind of key paradoxes that arise then, at least for economists. One is that we do have these rising levels of education, but these don't seem to be reflected in terms of participation and economic opportunities. And secondly, that in many developing countries around the world, there have been reasonably good rates of growth, economic growth, but again, this doesn't seem to have been translating through to what we see in terms of opportunities. Latin America is actually quite an interesting exception to what we see more broadly in terms of labour force participation. And actually, it's a good example because it also shows the gains from increasing labour force participation over time. So the dark line here shows the global rate, which as I mentioned was kind of stagnating, then fell since 1990 from around 57 to 55%. And you can contrast that with what's happened in the Latin American region, where there's a very significant rise in participation over the same period. So initially it was way below the global average and now it's slightly above. And interestingly, what this has also been associated with in that region is significant falls in poverty over the same period and significant declines in inequality as well. And actually, colleagues at the bank who have analysed the causes of the improvements in poverty and inequality over that period attribute about 30% of the improvements just to women's increased labour force participation and women's earnings. So it's quite a good argument for a focus on labour force participation. But as I mentioned earlier, labour force participation only really gives you part of the picture. One of the reasons why, frankly, I think it's often relied upon is it's one of the few bits of data that we have for a large number of countries, and it's kind of roughly comparable, and so it's often used. It's much more widely available than wage data, for example. But what we did here for the 10 largest developing countries for which we could get data, which include India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, Egypt, Turkey, is to look at 3 dimensions. And just to show you, I think, 2 important things. One is that the patterns differ depending upon which dimension you're looking at. And relatedly, looking at only one dimension may give you a very misleading picture. So let's take the example of Turkey. So Turkey, if we just looked at the wage gap, you can see their wage gap is pretty much closed. Women earn almost the same as men, almost 100% of what men earn. But look at their labour force participation rate. It's only about 25%. So it's only about half the rate of men's. It's this one here. And similarly, across all of the countries, depending upon which dimension you're looking at, you can get a slightly different picture. It's not that one dimension is more important necessarily than another, but I think it underlines the importance of taking a multidimensional approach. There may be very high rates of participation, which we see, for example, in Rwanda, Tanzania, some of the lowest income countries in the world. Labour force participation rates are around 90%. But that doesn't mean that women have good jobs or are running, kind of profitable enterprises. Many of them are actually in jobs which are very difficult indeed. So that's the important point I just wanted to make on the labour force or caveat on the labour force participation side. And I also wanted to kind of introduce into the conversation the important point that we can't assume that rising levels of education will necessarily be translated into increases in economic opportunities. And the starkest example of that is actually in the Middle East and North Africa, which includes about kind of 10 or 12 economies, depending upon how much data you have, I guess. Here we show the increases in primary school enrolment and secondary school enrolment between 1990 and 2011. And then on the final couple of bars show labour force participation, which again is pretty much flat. And actually, if you go to the tertiary level for these countries, I think the female rates actually exceed the male rates in these countries. So there's been very little progress in terms of women's economic opportunities in these countries, despite the advances in education. And then finally, this is, again, just in terms of kind of setting the scene, and I think an important message, not necessarily for this group, but certainly for hardcore economists, is that incomes don't necessarily increase economic opportunities either. So you don't need to be an economist to see that there's no relation between the 2 things on this graph. So here we have a measure of economic opportunities. This is actually from the World Economic Forum. And then the higher the value, the more equal the economic opportunities are in the country. We can talk about the specifics if you like. It's not a perfect measure because the data is not perfect, but broadly speaking, higher is better. This is a log of per capita GDP, so the rich countries are here. But if you, at any particular point for a given level of income, you can see a big range of outcomes or kind of economic opportunities here on the left-hand side. So if you compare, for example, Lesotho and Pakistan, both have pretty much the same level of per capita income, about $1,200, but you can see that the economic opportunities for women in Lesotho, according to this measure, are much larger than those in Pakistan. So that's an important point, I think, to make, and it begins to hint at the importance of kind of the policy environment and the structural norms and the other factors which determine women's economic opportunities beyond the level of income and growth. It's also interesting, and this is just by way of illustration, I was in Rwanda last week, so put this together for that context. But I think it's just interesting to see how countries don't necessarily do well on all the different aspects in which we're interested at the same time. And Rwanda is an interesting example because we can compare their labour force participation, which I mentioned is very high. Actually, their political participation is very high. You may know that now 64% of their MPs in the National Parliament are women, the highest in the world by far. And they do well on some other dimensions, but less well on others. So it's just a way of kind of comparing how they how they look relative to African comparators as world comparators as well. And generally speaking, what we see is that kind of good performance in some areas, but not necessarily good overall. Although I guess in some cases, relatively adverse outcomes do sometimes go together. So let me just go now to kind of why we see this coming about and the themes that we look at in the report. And actually, this is the report, and I think there are hard copies available for anyone who's interested at the back here. It's also downloadable as well. Kind of I've established that there's large gaps, they're persistent over time, but we need to try and understand why and how these are coming about. Certainly if education is not going to be kind of the solution, and certainly if growth is not going to sufficiently address our constraints as well. And broadly speaking, where we come out is a focus on the importance of social norms in institutions. So what I mean by social norms are kind of the attitudes and behaviours which shape people's behaviours and perceptions and also choices as well. In some cases, these may be formalised in laws, and I'll go into that in a moment as well. The other point to make, which I think is important, and that's one which we tried to stress as well in the report, is that these constraints can be very important, for example, for productive age women. When you have kids, if there's no childcare, that can be a problem and a constraint. But what we see more broadly is that it's important to take a life cycle approach. It's important to be thinking about constraints which can emerge actually quite young. Even among infants, there have been studies which have been done that show how people have different, parents can have different kind of attitudes, if you like, and behaviours with respect to male and female children, which in turn affect their behaviours and ultimately aspirations and opportunities as well. Likewise, looking at what happens in the elderly years is very important too. So I'll go into that in a moment. So just beginning then with norms, it's difficult to capture norms, and you know there's a variety of ways in which we can glean information about people's attitudes, in this case to women's economic opportunities. There is a question in the World Values Survey, which is a global survey which is done about every 10 years, which actually has a number of interesting questions around a whole range of issues, including ones around political leadership and economic opportunities. And there's a question which is phrased something like, when jobs are scarce, do you believe that men should have priority? And this is the share of the population here who believe that men should have priority. You can see it becomes quite high in a number of countries here. But the interesting thing here is that what we tried to do was say, well, does that have much of a difference? Does that make much of an impact in practice? And so we grafted against actual the ratio of female to male labour force participation. So that's what we have on the vertical here. And so what we can see, broadly speaking, is that countries which don't have as much bias in terms of their beliefs about men having priority over jobs are also more likely to have higher rates of female relative to male participation. So that's just showing, I guess, the reasonably obvious point that norms matter. You know, when people believe that men should have priority over jobs, in fact, what happens is that relatively fewer women work, and we see this here for a relatively large number of countries. But trying to understand how this happens in practice, it's useful to have some kind of framework. And what we did in the report was actually use the framework which had been developed for the World Development Report 2012. So the 2013 WDR was on jobs, but the one in the preceding year was on gender. And the one on gender developed this framework, which I think is quite useful as a way of trying to think about outcomes and inequalities. And what it did was look at, on the right-hand side here, the different dimensions of equality and inequality that we're interested in, like economic opportunities, endowments, which include health and education, and agency, which is about choice and the expansion of choice, and how these are affected by the cogs on the left-hand side of this wheel. And I think the important point here is not, I think a couple of things. One, to kind of be explicit about the different things which matter. So, for example, if we're concerned about outcomes in terms of economic opportunities, and we know that there's a law which restricts women's working hours. That's one thing here. This is around formal institutions. But in order for that to make a difference, it also depends what's happening in the other cogs as well. So it matters what's happening in terms of informal institutions and norms. It matters what's happening within the household and kind of expectations between spouses. And it also matters what's happening in the labour market, whether or not employers are prepared to, for example, recruit women in this case. So thinking about the different parts, I think, can be quite a useful way of trying to think more fully about what are likely to be the impacts of any particular policy change. And what we see in practice is that the formal barriers in particular are very important. And these are actually quite well documented for anyone who's interested, and I think there's some kind of good research to be done as well in a publication called Women, Business and the Law, which is updated by the World Bank every couple of years, and it covers 143 countries, and it documents discrimination between men and women, and in particular married men and married women. And basically what it's looking at is whether or not there are differences in how they're treated with respect to, for example, signing a contract, inheriting property, obtaining an ID, different aspects related to family law. So it's kind of broadly speaking around economic opportunities, but basically just looking, is there a difference on the books in terms of how the legislation or statute is written in between the way that men and women, and in particular between married men and married women, because a number of the constraints we see actually arise upon marriage. So, a woman may actually have a much more legal autonomy, at least, before she's married. When she's married in a number of countries, the man becomes the head of the household, and she loses decision-making autonomy in a number of areas. So basically what this shows, well, to give you the bottom line, there are almost 130 countries which have at least one constraint. There are about 30 countries which have more than 10 constraints, and this shows you by region the average number of constraints. So this is the Middle East and North Africa here. So the average number of constraints in those countries is 18. In South Asia it's 10. In the other countries, it's a bit less. But the good news is that these constraints do change over time. So, for example, in Africa, about half of the total number of constraints that were on the books 50 years ago have been repealed. We recently did a historical study as well. So there's a lot kind of happening over time. And in general, you do see the trend in terms of change, that is repeal of these sorts of laws. In some countries, though, they're actually quite sticky and can be quite controversial. I was in Côte d'Ivoire, I think it was last year, and the government actually fell when they started trying to repeal, I think, some of these head of household laws. But then related to these laws, and I guess more deeply held, and aspects which may not necessarily change, even if there's legislative reforms, are kind of underlying discrimination in terms of people's attitudes, how households function, and relationships between spouses. What we did in more recent work, and we're actually launching the report on Wednesday on voice and agency, is look at data across 54 countries at proxies for lack of decision-making power in the household. It's very difficult to get that just in one single indicator, but what we did was to use data where questions are asked like, for example, do you think it's okay to be beaten by your husband? Yes or no? And that's a question which is actually asked in this survey, this demographic and health survey. Another question is, do you have a say over major spending household decisions? Yes or no? Another one is, were you married before the age of 18? Yes or no? So when we look at that across all of these 54 developing countries, what we find is that 4 out of 5 women in this survey, which are nationally representative household surveys, face at least one of these so-called deprivations. So that means either they think it's okay to be beaten by their husband, they don't have a say over household spending, or they were married as children. And the actual figures are here, 43%, 42%, and 51%. We also have a significant minority group here, like a core group, we might call them, who are subject to all three deprivations at the same time. That is, they think it's okay to be beaten, they don't have a say over spending, and they were married young. This is the global average for the whole sample. Among women who only have primary education who are in rural areas, that share rises to 20%. For urban tertiary educated women, it drops to 1 in 20. It doesn't drop to 0, but it drops to about 1 in 20. But then we look at countries like Niger, which is a poor country in West Africa where the norms are particularly adverse, and actually we've done some recent qualitative work there. You can see that 99% of the women are subject to at least one of these deprivations, and nearly half are subject to all three at the same time. And over 70 are accepting violence, lacking control, and being married young. So that's giving you, I guess, a somewhat extreme but not entirely unusual case in terms of adverse norms at the country level. So as I mentioned earlier, what emerges from the report is a sense that when we're thinking about these norms, it's important to be thinking obviously about the ones which are affecting productive age women, particularly in terms of time constraints and work opportunities and the legal discrimination I was talking about, the fact that in a number of countries they can't own land, for example. But we also need to be thinking about what's happening in the earlier years, which are affecting their life choices, and may also lead to differential accumulation of skills and possibilities for work, as well as what happens in the elderly years. In a number of countries, for example, they still have discrimination in terms of retirement age. So women retire kind of 2 to 5 years earlier than men in a number of Eastern European, and had been the case in a number of East Asian countries as well. But then the final point just to make and to wrap up this part here is with respect to burdens on productive age women, that the focus I think has quite rightly been on childcare and unpaid care of the nature that Annabelle had mentioned earlier. But I think increasingly important as well is the burden of elderly care. What this graph here shows through 2060 is the child dependency ratio, and that declining over time, and then very significant increases in the old age dependency ratio from around 9, almost tripling to 26% by 2060. And actually, if you look at this graph for China, I think it's crossing next year or the year after. And so thinking about the responsibilities that this places on children, and oftentimes female children in terms of elderly care, I think is something that we need to be thinking a lot more in terms of the policy agenda. So I just wanted to put that out there. So this is just getting to the final part, and there's a bit less detail here because I think that, what matters and what makes sense is going to be very country and local specific in nature. So this is a global report. We can think about kind of global patterns and the sorts of kind of potential issues, the types of analysis that can be done, but it's really what we call the country diagnostics, which is important to work out what's important. And what we argue, kind of broadly speaking, is a kind of 3-level approach. One is around government actions, and that's levelling the playing field, so obviously getting rid of the discriminatory legislation, thinking about constraints over the life cycle, and also thinking about ways in which some of these multiple constraints might be overcome. We also argue that the private sector has an important role to play, that there's been, whilst there has been, I think, an increased recognition and some more activity around kind of corporate actions to promote gender equality, typically it's much more, put it this way, there's much more that can be done. And one of the key areas where there's kind of room for change and growth is trying to enable this opening up in terms of occupational segregation to get a lot more women into non-traditional jobs and roles and so on. And then the final one that we point out here, we go into it in a bit more in the report, I won't talk about it today, under SES interest, is around access to financial services, because we also know that women have much less access to banking services than men do in much of the world. And then the final point here is around data gaps and closing the knowledge gaps. there's remarkably little available on a cross-country comparable basis for a lot of the issues that we're interested in here. And these gaps have existed for some period of time. I think there's greater recognition again of the importance of these gaps as new initiatives underway at the international level to try and close those gaps, but that's very important. I've just got some examples here of some of the work that the bank has been doing in each of these sorts of areas, but these are just more by kind of way of illustration, talking about the types of diagnostics that can be done. This is an example from Kenya, nice program in Liberia with adolescent girls seeking to improve vocational skills, but also life skills training. And there's, I think, some good evidence that can work quite effectively, not only in terms of increasing incomes, but also increasing the confidence and aspirations of girls and allowing them, for example, to take greater control over their sexual and reproductive health. Some good examples as well about the sorts of programs that can be used to extend childcare, for example. And then finally, one on Vietnam about retirement ages, but there are other examples as well from Eastern Europe. But I can talk more about these sorts of country examples as well. And then finally, just on the investing in evidence and data, it is an area where there's still a lot that we know that we don't know. And we need to learn about what works as well as what doesn't work, and evaluating it much more systematically in this effort. The World Bank and a lot of others have been doing this, I think, much more systematically over the past several years. What we've done is put together the impact evaluations that have been supported by the World Bank just onto one website. Frankly, when we decided to do this, and it was a young colleague who suggested that we do so, I thought that there'd maybe be 15 or 20 of these. I didn't think there were a huge number, so we could just put them on the website, because there wasn't actually one place where you could find all of the impact evaluations that the bank had done on gender. Turns out there were 160, so it was quite a worthwhile exercise, actually even just pulling them all together. And we've just categorised them in terms of economic opportunities, health, education, with quite simple summaries about the methodology, the study, the type of intervention, and obviously links to the paper as well. So if you're interested in this area, it'd be great if you can have a look and to give us feedback as well. So these are the kind of main messages which will emerge. These are more, for a broader audience in terms of underlining the importance of the agenda, that we can't assume that growth and education is going to close the gaps, that there's a need for proactive public action because there are these very systemic underlying sources of discrimination and disadvantage which aren't being overcome naturally with the course of time. And that we need to address these systematically across the life cycle in ways which allow girls as well as women to expand their opportunities and to make the choices that they would like to pursue. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
You mentioned that when the intervention doesn't work, you have a systematic approach, just a few minutes ago, a systematic approach to changing that intervention. Could you give us an example, maybe of a recent intervention that didn't work and how quickly the feedback loop operated and what you did to reform that?
Well, I'm not saying it works. I don't think we have a systematic process for doing that. I think we're trying to do it more, but I actually do have a good example from Jordan, where there was a wage subsidy program. Kind of a training and wage subsidy program for adolescent girls to facilitate the school to work transition. And it was initially evaluated, I think, like 3 months into the program, and it was fabulous success. The girls were being trained, they were working, their incomes had gone up and so on. And then we went back 6 months later after the wage subsidy had finished, and none of them were working, and it was pretty much a failure. And so what that showed was that kind of a short-term intervention, even with a subsidy, wasn't enough. And actually what it also showed, because I think there was actually part of the program which continued to be subsidised, but basically there was such deep-seated discrimination by employers against young women that they still weren't prepared to take them on. And there are a whole host of reasons for that. Some of them I think had to do with kind of direct kind of gender discrimination. I think there were also difficulties in firing people, which deterred employers from hiring people. So there are a bunch of structural issues going on. But it led to, I think, quite an interesting kind of dialogue with the Ministry of Labour and with the government there. And it was also interesting because I remember when I first took on this job, it was being hailed as a success story. Then we realised kind of 3 or 6 months later that in fact it was a case where it wasn't working. But I think one of the issues, and I think this is very generally recognised in the academic world, is that there's a publication bias towards things that work and things which have an impact, and things which don't have an impact are much more difficult to publish. And so it's actually more difficult to find that type of evidence, because when you send it to a journal and you had an intervention, you tested the intervention, it actually didn't do anything, it's not as interesting. So that's a problem, at least in economics, I think, or in development economics, that it's more difficult to publish stuff which doesn't show an effect. So some of the interventions are being tested, but they may not be captured in the way that they should be to learn what doesn't work. And also people don't necessarily want to publicise as much, right, what doesn't work.
Some of the graphs early on, you showed like averages for countries based on like different indicators for whether or not there's equality in the system, and so it's like lumped together by age. Is there a difference with younger women versus older women? So is there actually a change, but you just don't see it because it's sort of averaged out? So are the younger women still facing the same inequality?
Well, for the labour force, for most of the data, we don't have really good information over time for different cohorts. I do know for we do have graphs. If you look in the report, we have a bunch of graphs on labour force participation for cohorts for different age groups, which looks like this. So this is 15 to 24, 25 to 34, then older ones here. So basically falling pretty, kind of peaking pretty young and then falling pretty quickly. So we can look at those ones, but they're kind of cross sections over time. And then some of the, this is in Africa, there's a much bigger graph. And the black one is men and the yellow one is women. So, I mean, there are some studies which are quite interesting on this. So for example, in Australia at least, and I think in a number of industrial countries where they've done this type of work, for women after they have a child, their pay tends to go down. For men, after there's a child born in the family, their pay tends to go up. So there's this, there's stuff going on like that you can see at different points in the life cycle as well. But in general, for many countries at least, the data is so weak that it's difficult to get a sense. I think for one of the reasons why we have this adolescent girls initiative at the bank, which is operating in about 8 low-income countries, is that the school-to-work transition, I think, is particularly difficult for girls in many developing countries, and particularly in countries where there's high rates of child marriage and so on. And so that's why we're trying to kind of focus on enabling a successful transition there. It's not that once that's done, everything else is solved, but it seems to be a particular point in time where there are major challenges.
So, in talking about work and labor, is there any credit or credence given to, or rather, what is the World Bank also addressing work done at home? Like, are they also making that a desirable thing for men to do? Because there seems to be a devaluation of like women's work in the home, and I know that's like not included even as a part of the informal economy, but that should be included as a form of labor because it is. So you're sending women into the workforce, but not addressing the issue of what happens to the children if the men are already presupposedly not there. So where do those two things overlap?
Well, discuss in the report about kind of norms in particular around kind of childcare and housework and so on. And what we do see systematically across countries, as you mentioned, is kind of much larger time burden on women in terms of kind of all of the work that needs to be done. There is a lot of good work being done now, I think, on unpaid care. There's quite a good report that was done earlier this year or late last year by the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, if you're interested, which kind of documents the extent of unpaid care and the importance of recognition. And there are, I think, some interesting ideas around this which are being discussed in international circles. I mean, part of it, I think, in developing countries has a lot to do as well with improvements in infrastructure to release burdens on women's time. You know, a lot of it's spent on stuff that, you know, like carrying water and, you know, getting firewood and stuff which is both very backbreaking and arduous as well as extremely time consuming. I lived in Kenya and, you know, many women, you know, you'd see with the kind of huge burdens just collecting the firewood every day and having to go further and further. So doing something about kind of releasing that time burden and enabling an equitable sharing, I think is very important. But I guess what we're also interested in is enabling kind of economic opportunities as well. And some of that might come from kind of recognition of work at home, but more generally it's going to come from kind of opportunities outside the home as well.
How do you mitigate what's going on? So you're saying that economic opportunities are being created outside of the home, but the norms are showing that women are still disproportionately supposed to take care of the home. So who takes care of the home if is there any credence given to the emotional work that goes into raising a family? Like, it just seems like there's a disconnect between the expectations of the project and the norms that are already in place. Like, those two things don't seem to be a solution to mitigating the problem. If the problem is gender equality, are we assessing that gender equality is financial equality? Is that the...
No. As I tried to say at the outset, equality is about kind of having choices and being able to choose what to do. So I want to stay home, look after kids. I would like to go and work at the World Bank or do something else. Or I would like to do both in different ways. And so it's about enabling choice in different ways. And attitudes do change over time. So if you look, for example, at the US, around just before the Second World War, I think 80% of people thought that women shouldn't work. Now the figure's something like 20%. So, you know, attitudes do change over time. So I think that they're not, and importantly, I think through demonstration effects, affecting how, you know, people perceive what's normal and what's not normal. But I think addressing the time constraints at home kind of continues to be an issue. We had a panel recently which included, or a meeting I guess, that included the Swedish Minister for Development, and she was kind of bemoaning that in Sweden, you know, there was such an unequal time burden there still between women and men, whereas most of us think of Sweden as being, you know, a place which has kind of sorted out at least most of these sorts of problems. So I think it's something which is clearly a factor which needs to be taken into account, but I don't think it's a reason not to be thinking about enabling economic opportunities.
I heard that the World Bank is also making an effort to integrate human rights perspectives into their work. And I'd love to hear more about that. I think in a lot of cases these things are seen to be antithetical to one another. I mean, in this presentation, the assumption underlying it seems to be that, for example, participation in the labor force is an automatic good, regardless of the conditions under which that labor takes place, or as she was just pointing out, that creates a double burden of work outside the home and work in the home. So how are these things being brought together?
Well, I think as I tried to say, it's not about everyone having to work or everyone not working. It's about enabling choice. And I think there are strong synergies with the global human rights agenda. So if you look at the indicators which are picked up in women, business and the law, nearly all of them come from CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which has been ratified by 188 countries around the world. So I think there are important synergies. They're not exactly the same thing. We deal with ministries of finance, and we kind of point out the economic costs of, for example, not utilising the productive potential of women who have now graduated from kind of either primary school, high school or university. But I think in many, if not most cases, it's quite complementary to a rights-based approach. And we've been doing work kind of more directly using that lens, in particular on the voice and agency side, around kind of violence and around participation and so on. But I think, it's good. I mean, I've got a couple of law degrees. I can easily kind of, highlight what the differences are. And actually the conference I was at in Rwanda a couple of weeks ago was a human rights conference. But I think overplaying the differences is not fruitful. I think it's important to be thinking about kind of the synergies. And I think that only talking to an audience that believes in rights is not necessarily going to get you very far. You need to think about kind of ways in which it can be done. And I think the law has an important role to play, and international law has an important role to play, because international law is actually much more progressive than many national frameworks, but it's not going to get us the whole way. So we need to be thinking about other mechanisms as well, and incentives.
Such as, this is precisely what I'm interested in.
Well, so for example, you can say that the cost of women not participating in the labour market in MENA is something like 18% of their GDP annually, and the cost in Australia exceeds the value of the mining boom. So you can work out what the economic costs of some of these things are, and in the case of the Middle East and North Africa, those figures are off the top of my head. I can't remember exactly what they are. They've been estimated by Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and people. But basically, what you're saying is, or what you're pointing out, is that there have been enormous investments in the skills and education of a large part of the population, which doesn't have the opportunity then to kind of pursue those opportunities.
On some of the questions about women's productive years and their reproductive years being sort of coinciding. Mm-hmm. So has there been any attempts to work with, whether it's states, because I know, as you said earlier, that most of the funding from the World Bank goes into states to provide sort of, socialized childcare centers or, state-based or corporate-based childcare, mm-hmm. as a way of offsetting some of those time to labor burdens that women are disproportionately experience?
Yeah, I mean, there are some examples, more in middle-income countries. So there's an example here from Mexico, which was a childcare voucher program. And there are some other examples, I think, from other parts of Latin America as well. I know that a colleague of mine was also thinking about the possibility of putting, it was a big kind of urban transit program, and they're looking at the possibility of actually putting or installing creches at the train stations, because one of the difficulties that working women face is that they've got to go there to drop the child and then go to there to go to work. So they're to kind of integrate it into kind of urban transport systems, basically. So I think there's some innovative thinking going on, and then also community-based childcare. And then the other thing that they're trying to think about as well, or we're trying to think about, is flexibility in terms of kind of programming. So with the vocational training, traditionally there was pretty low take-up and also quite high dropout among women and young women. And when they actually looked to see why that was the case, it was because they were requiring them to be there for 8 hours a day for 6 weeks, when it basically wasn't possible for them to do that. And so offering programs which are much more flexible in terms of time, shorter periods of time, possibly over a longer period of time or more concentrated, did a much better job in terms of reducing the attrition, from the program. So a lot of it's just commonsensical, but I think thinking about kind of the constraints and working around the constraints is important in order to be able to make an effect.
But has the World Bank funded any of those?
Yeah, this Mexico one is a bank one. Yeah, there's a few childcare ones, but I think they're mainly, and I think some from the informal Soviet Union as well. Yeah. And then I think there are some examples as well, kind of more community-based ones in Africa.
For example, one of the indicators was like the lack of control over household income.
Mhm.
So is that just an indicator that if you see that response, it's a correlated with less equality? Or is it something where if that were addressed, you would have better outcomes? And since that's a social norm, how do you actually correct that?
Well, it's just a proxy. So what we're trying to look at is kind of decision-making and control in the household. So trying to get at this black box of, this one I had earlier, this one. So you've got kind of household intra-household bargaining. So it's really difficult to work out actually what's going on. But one indicator is whether or not women have a say. There's a whole bunch of questions, and actually they're in some ways more interesting ones, but they're a bit more specific. So do you have a say over visiting friends and family? There's one on that, and it's about a third of women say they don't have any say over that. There's one on, do you make your own healthcare decisions? Like, can you decide when you want to go and see a provider? Many women don't have that. There's the ones around spending, so big decisions, small decisions. Anyway, there's a whole range of them. None of them is perfect, and each of them is partial, but I think each of them kind of provides some insight. And on the spending one, one of the kind of hypotheses could be that women having more income and greater control over income could enable them to have more control over spending decisions in the household. And we do see that to some extent, but there's not necessarily an automatic correlation. And frankly, I wasn't talking about it here today, but it's worth mentioning that there's also evidence that increased income and economic opportunities can also lead to increased tension in the household and increased risk of violence, in particular in cases where there's a lot of economic instability, sometimes in post-conflict contexts, where there's high rates of male unemployment. That can also pose risks as well. So the findings on this are a little bit mixed.
You spoke a little bit about the changing of social norms in the U.S., particularly after the World War, noting that women entered the workforce largely because men were absent. That's kind of like a schism that we wouldn't expect to occur across global scales, right? So I don't necessarily know how much of a fair comparison it would be to make that for the U.S. And changing norms in terms of women in the workforce in other countries. So, like Professor Flay was asking, is the World Bank supporting more of a socialist perspective in terms of integrating women into the workforce, or is like finance, economics, and capitalism the kind of underlying role that the World Bank is playing in mitigating that change?
I think what we're endorsing is a mixed market economy. So based on private ownership, largely, but with a very active role for the government and for the public sector, in particular in ending poverty and reducing inequality. Market economy is where it's kind of similar to pretty much every country in the world. I don't think there are any socialist economies left, are there? Cuba, maybe? So it's basically an economy where you can own things, you can sell things, the government regulates, it taxes people, it spends money.
You mentioned that part of the solution is sort of encouraging the private sector to do more. I'm curious as to what the World Bank thinks the private sector how they can help to alleviate sort of discrepancy between male and female work and poverty in general in these countries.
Well, they could. I mean, there's lots of things that the private sector can do. I mean, the private sector is a source of about 90% of jobs, and so what we see going on in the labour market is mainly a function of private sector decisions. So I think they have the same sorts of kind of norms and expectations or sometimes somewhat different to the population at large, so that stereotypes about who should do what job and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, hiring people for some sorts of jobs or for others. There's quite a lot of good evidence, which you may well be aware of, from the US and from other countries about discrimination, against people based on, what their names are and, whether or not they sound foreign or whether they come from a bad part of town or whether they're male or female. So I think there's a lot of discrimination as well on the part of employers, which is important to overcome. They can also, beyond doing that, introduce more kind of affirmative action, type programs. So targets in terms of representation in management, on boards, those sorts of goals I think can play quite an important role. And even if there's not explicit targets or goals, I think even reporting on those sorts of numbers, seem to make a difference over time in terms of affecting kind of behaviours within organisations. So I think there's a lot to do with recruitment and kind of the types of jobs to which people are recruited, and there's a lot to do as well with kind of career kind of management and enabling kind of growth of individual employees over time. I was actually just reviewing a very interesting survey that had been recently done in Australia about pregnancy and pregnancy discrimination, and showing that very large proportions of women felt discriminated against in the event of pregnancy in a whole range of ways. Even though they had legal entitlements to take leave and so on, many have been discriminated against in terms of kind of their job prospects. A number of them had been kind of laid off and so on as well. And then interestingly, there's also provision now in Australia for paternal leave, and so they surveyed the fathers as well. And many, although not as extensive, shares also reported discrimination there as well, where they were taking up the paternal leave. So this is very much to do, I think, with kind of the norms and kind of attitudes within organisations. And I think the discrimination that people were reporting was oftentimes, I think, by their bosses, but also sometimes by their peers and so on as well. So I think kind of creating cultures which are more supportive is very important too.
Can the World Bank sort of control that, or just simply encourage that they change these discriminatory practices? If they're private sector, technically.
No, sure. Well, we do. There's a branch of the bank group which lends to the private sector called the IFC and the International Finance Corporation. They've actually introduced targets for women on boards for IFC clients, and have a group or an initiative called Winvest, which is about more progressive gender practices in firms and sharing good practices. And it includes a number of kind of quite large, even kind of multinational type companies, as well as kind of domestic firms. And they do things like, for example, introduce childcare, introduce flexibility, introduce leave, enable kind of a whole range of innovations which haven't necessarily been evaluated in a very rigorous way, but they're kind of documenting what they're doing and sharing what they're doing. So if you Google Winvest and IFC, you'll see what's being done there. But it's more kind of peer learning and sharing and so on. Although the mandates are real, I think, the corporate targets are real for the boards, but that really only gets you the top part. It doesn't necessarily get you, the rest of the organisation.
So I had a question in terms of, so I'm thinking about, like, I look at things intersectionally, and I'm thinking about not just gender, but other issues that divide us: religion, race, ethnicity, nation status, immigrant, migrant worker. Is there anything that you're looking at in combination with this? Because one of the critiques of something like an affirmative action program is, even if it's not designed to be quota-based, becomes quota-based, or just like a check mark list. Is there a way in which you're maybe trying to find a sophisticated way to look at these combinations of things in terms of discrimination?
No, I think it's very important, because I think that the intersectionality is critical when talking about disadvantage, and I alluded to that a bit before. So, some of the risks that I was talking about, these averages are for the population at large, and if you're talking about kind of rural, primary educated women, and then ethnic minorities and other groups, then the figures and the risks can be much, much worse. So that's the sort of thing that we would normally pick up in kind of country level analysis. With the global analysis, it's a bit more difficult because the data is much more limited. But certainly with the country level one, if you look at the work we do in Latin America, for example, there's quite a big focus on indigenous groups as well and other forms of exclusion. So I think it's something which certainly needs to be taken into account, and typically will require some forms of affirmative action, but not necessarily quotas. It'll be other sorts of things, I think, which are needed, kind of starting young, maybe community level, those sorts of things as well. But in India, in South, much of the world, I think these issues are pretty big. There's quite a nice report, if you're interested in these issues, there's a report called Inclusion Matters, which was published about 6 months ago by the bank, by colleagues who work more on the social development side. And it very much got into kind of these sorts of issues and how to deal with them and how to think with them about them. Probably a bit less on the policy side, but I think quite rich kind of analysis of the challenges.
And I know, like you talked in lunch, like a lot of funders are industrialized nations, but has the World Bank ever considered going in and helping, for example, Native American populations or indigenous populations in North America who technically are sovereign nations but aren't treated as such, that the conditions are very much like third or fourth world country or fourth world nations? Has that ever been a consideration?
Good question, but not directly. I mean, there's probably some interaction through kind of civil society work and so on, because it's quite open from that point of view with different groups and so on. But not in terms of kind of financial support, I don't think. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up question, do you get any sort of pushback or challenges from the U.S.? Because I mean, they haven't signed on to CDAW. They're have an indigenous population, as she just mentioned, that it isn't incorporated into the nation. So I'm just kind of curious about the bank's relationship with the U.S. and some of the ways in which the bank is, and even around sort of issues of gender equity, or like affirmative action sort of under attack in the U.S. So it's just kind of interesting that some of the ways in which you're speaking about bank policies are really running counter to some of the ways in which those same policies are sort of under attack or not even considered in the U.S. And since the U.S. is such a big donor country, I didn't know how that, do you get any pushback or challenges, or is it not even considered?
Well, I guess traditionally the leadership has been kind of from the Nordics and some of the Europeans, I think, who have been most kind of forthright and active. But in fact, the US has been very supportive. When I came to the job, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and she was extremely active on the global stage. And I think very supportive. And Cathy Russell, Milan Verveer, then Cathy Russell, have been kind of partners with whom we've worked very closely. They're the ambassador for women and girls. So, yeah, it may not be totally connected to what's happening domestically, but certainly in terms of the development agenda, I think very progressive and very supportive in the work that they do. So, and kind of frankly not that much difference, vis-a-vis kind of the Europeans and other countries. And actually one of the changes, I think, which has happened on the gender agenda is that traditionally there was, I think, a bit of a divide between kind of the Nordics on the one hand and kind of the rest of the world there. But when this World Development Report went to the board, and then we had an operational kind of implications paper which followed up, I think there's like 24 or 26 members of the board because they represent different constituencies. And there was a statement endorsing, the findings and the follow-up and so on, which was unanimous, which was great because, I think that traditionally, the fact that some didn't really support it was a way of kind of slowing back and an excuse for inaction. But I think the fact that, at least there's agreement now on the basics. They may not agree on all of the specific policies and concrete actions, but kind of broadly speaking on the diagnostic and the overall direction, I think is great for the overall agenda. So then it puts the onus on us to be working at more concrete ways, to move the agenda forward. But I think there's much more convergence than there had been in the past. I mean, it's not to say it doesn't come up still, so every time there's the Commission on the Status of Women or, the conferences around family planning and so on. I mean, there are issues which still divide kind of countries, particularly around reproductive rights. But in general, I think there's quite a lot of convergence.
Is there any convergence around international law? Because international law, I agree with you, it's so much more progressive than many, many countries, but it's so weak. And it's, in its ability to enforce any of the international laws.
Well, they have, yeah. I mean, that CEDAW has a committee, so they go and visit and they do reports. And I think it's a great benchmark and reference point. And the fact that practically every country signed, except Sudan, Palau, Somalia and the US is good. Actually, the US has signed, it hasn't ratified. At the same time, what I didn't say is that a number of countries have reservations, so they've got exceptions, so they haven't signed up to the whole convention. But I think it's an important basis, but I think working out ways to take it forward. It has been used in particular countries by civil society to lobby for reform, and we have a couple of examples of that in the Voice and Agency report. But I think in Egypt and a couple of other North African countries, they've actually used CEDAW as a basis to lobby, because they say to the government, you've signed up to this one, what's the story? This legislation contravenes. So I think it has been used and it is useful, but it's clearly not enough. We need to move forward.
Last question?
Do you mind going back to the slide before this one? Can you speak to it all, any at all about the outliers? Because statistically, outliers tend to be really important, and I'm wondering why it is that Azerbaijan, for example, would that be 80% of believe men should have job priority, but the ratio of female to male labor force participation is really low as well?
Well, Azerbaijan is a country that was in the former Soviet Union, and all of the countries in the former Soviet Union, or all the countries in the USSR, have very high rates of labor force participation. So it's more of a legacy effect. I think it's probably declining over time. And I think it's but quite a traditional country. So there are a number of countries, I think in the former Soviet Union that had kind of women participating, certainly in the labour market, to a much larger extent than would have been the case otherwise, because of the Soviet laws.
Uganda, and I'm noticing that Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, and Egypt trend, maybe a religious trend there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how I think what I've been hearing is kind of a one-size-fits-most model, and just looking at this graph, I would assume that a lot of combating what seems to be quote-unquote umbrella gender inequality may need to be a lot more specific. So I'm just wondering how much control the World Bank actually has in what is the return? Here we go. What is the return on the World Bank's investment in gender inequality? What has it been so far? Because it has been a financial investment. So I'm assuming that you wouldn't invest in something that would give you low returns, and unless although the existence of the World Bank is supposed to be predicated on its non-existence 50, 100 years from now. I'm just missing I'm not making it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I was presenting a global report, but the main point I think to take away is the importance of understanding about what's going on at the country level and country diagnostics, which is what I tried to emphasise here. And that requires, I think, really quite a solid understanding of kind of what's going on, what are the norms, traditions, history, constraints, as well as opportunities. And then, you know, learning from civil society as well as, and from consultations as well as from the quantitative and empirical data about what makes sense.